I need to tell you about the day I realized my husband was a liar. It wasn't about another woman or money. It was a far more devastating lie. He looked me in the eye, held our newborn son, and promised me, "Eleanor, we are going to be okay. Our family is safe." He believed it. I believed it. But our blood held a secret, a curse he knew nothing about. That lie was hope itself, and its betrayal almost destroyed us all. This is a story about the monster that lives in the family tree, and the day I saw its face staring back at me from my own son's eyes. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 72 years old, speaking to you from my little home in Sierra Vista, Arizona, where the desert air smells of dust and creosote. For over 40 years, I've carried a story locked deep in my heart. A story of a love so bright it blinded me to the shadows gathering behind us. I was born right here in 1953. My father, Samuel, was a stonemason. His hands could make granite feel soft. My mother, Isabella, filled our home with the scent of thread and simmering tomatoes. We didn't have much, but we had a fortress of love. The only crack in that foundation was the whispered story of my great-grandfather, Silas. They said his mind would unravel like old yarn, that he saw people who weren't there, that he once tried to drown his own brother, convinced he was a demon wearing his skin. "A family curse," my grandmother would mutter, "but thank the Lord it skipped your father." How naive we were. Curses don't skip generations, they just wait. I met Arthur in the summer of 1972. He was an accountant, new to town, with shoulders broad enough to carry all my dreams and eyes the color of warm whiskey. Oh, Arthur. Our courtship was like a perfect sonnet. He was gentle, steadfast, a man built on promises he fully intended to keep. When he asked my father for my hand, he said, "Sir, I vow to spend my life making Eleanor feel as cherished as she is." And he did. We married in 75. A simple wedding, but my dress was stitched with love, and when I walked toward him, I saw tears of pure joy in his eyes. We built a life in a small adobe-style house. I started a little business baking pastries, and Arthur worked tirelessly, dreaming of his own firm. Our dream was a child, a family, and in 1978, our Lucas arrived. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a head of dark hair. Arthur would cradle him and whisper, "I'm going to teach you everything, my boy. We're going to fish in the canyons and you'll take over the business one day." Our house was filled with laughter, with the smell of baby powder and my apple pies. For years, it was a portrait of perfect happiness. We were so blind. Lucas was brilliant. He spoke in full sentences at 2, read by 4. Arthur's chest would puff with pride. "My boy is a genius, Eleanor." But there were flickers. At age 5, another child broke his sandcastle. My sweet boy didn't cry. He looked at that child with a chilling calm and said, "You will be sorry." Then he threw sand directly into the boy's eyes. When I scolded him, he looked genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, Mama, it was like someone else moved my hand." We brushed it off. A sensitive, intense child. But the real change came at 17. It was subtle at first. His impeccable room became a chaotic mess. He'd be awake all night writing in journals he'd snap shut if I entered. "Just studying, Mom." But his grades were plummeting. The school called. "Lucas is disruptive. He's different." The boy who loved his father began to answer him with a snarl. "Get out of my room! You don't understand anything." The first time I heard him arguing with an empty room, my blood ran cold. Arthur refused to see it. "It's a phase. He's a teenager." But I knew. The whispered stories of my great-grandfather Silas echoed in my mind. This was no phase. The breaking point was the night he didn't come home. We found him at dawn, reeking of cheap liquor from a bar across the border in Mexico. When Arthur confronted him, Lucas turned on him. "You're not my real father. You're an imposter, a copy." His eyes were wild, vacant. and in that horrifying moment, I saw it. I saw the same vacant stare they said my great-grandfather Silas had before he tried to drown his own brother. The family nightmare hadn't skipped us. It had been biding its time, and it had finally arrived. Before I continue this painful journey, my dears, I must ask you a small favor. If you understand this feeling of a perfect life beginning to crack, if you've ever felt a chill of fear for someone you love, please type, "I'm listening," in the comments below. It helps an old woman feel less alone in sharing these heavy memories. And if you're just joining us, please subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The doctor's words felt like a death sentence. Paranoid schizophrenia. Arthur crumpled beside me. No, not my son. He's just confused. But I knew. This was the betrayal written in our DNA. The life we built. The future Arthur promised. It was all a beautiful, fragile lie. We tried everything. Medications that made Lucas a ghost of himself. Therapy sessions he'd storm out of. He'd hide the pills, convinced they were poison. "The man in the coat told me you're trying to silence me," he'd scream. The man in the coat, his constant, invisible tormentor. My brilliant son was a prisoner in his own mind. The violence escalated. A shattered vase, a hole punched in the wall. Then, the night he held a kitchen knife, staring at Arthur, whispering about revealing the imposter's true face. We had to call the police. My own son, handcuffed and sedated in the back of a squad car as neighbors watched from their windows. The shame was a physical weight. The hardest journey of my life was the drive to the psychiatric hospital in Phoenix. Lucas, sedated in the back, then waking, pleading, "Mom, don't leave me here. I'll be good, I promise." His voice was my little boy's again, but when the orderlies took him, that voice twisted into something monstrous. "You're abandoning me. I hate you. You'll pay for this." Arthur and I drove home in a silence so heavy, I thought it would crush the car. We had done the right thing, the only thing. So why did it feel like the most profound betrayal of our child? For the next few months, we existed in a fog. Our house was a tomb. Arthur buried himself in work, starting a new branch of his accounting firm in Phoenix, a desperate attempt to be closer to Lucas. I visited our son every day, watching the medication turn him into a sluggish, hollowed-out version of himself. "He's stabilizing," the doctors said. But this wasn't living. And then, a flicker of hope, a new treatment plan. Lucas was discharged. We rented an apartment in Phoenix, a desperate attempt at a fresh start. For a few precious months, it almost worked. Lucas was quieter, more present. He even talked about going back to school. Arthur's eyes held a light I thought was extinguished forever. We were a family again, battered and scarred, but together. We dared to believe the worst was behind us. That belief was the final, cruelest lie. It was a Tuesday. Arthur had driven back to Sierra Vista for a meeting. Lucas and I had a quiet dinner. He seemed calm. He took his medication and went to bed. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. It was Benjamin, Arthur's business partner. His voice was broken, barely recognizable. There'd been an incident, a fight at a bar. Arthur had tried to break it up, a knife. He was gone. The world stopped. My Arthur, my rock, the man who promised me a safe future, murdered in a senseless moment of border town violence. I hung up the phone, the silence of the apartment screaming in my ears. How could I possibly tell my mentally fragile son that his hero, his father, was never coming home? I found Lucas standing in the doorway of his room. His face was eerily serene. "The man in the coat told me Dad was gone," he said, his voice flat. "He said it was time for it to be just us." And in that moment, I didn't see my son. I saw the curse, cold and triumphant. It had taken my husband, and now it was claiming my boy. The doctor's words in that cold, sterile office in Phoenix felt less like a diagnosis and more like a death sentence for the family we had been. Paranoid schizophrenia. Arthur physically crumpled beside me, his head in his hands. "No," he whispered, a broken record. "Not my son. He's stressed. He's a teenager. He's just confused." But I knew. This was the betrayal that had been written in our DNA for generations. The beautiful, sprawling life we had built, the golden future Arthur had so confidently promised me while holding our infant son. It was all a magnificent, fragile lie, and it was shattering in front of us. We tried everything. We became slaves to the pharmacy, to the little orange bottles that promised stability. But the medications made Lucas a ghost of himself. They smoothed out the jagged edges of his psychosis, but sanded down his soul in the process. He was lethargic, emotionally flat, a hollowed-out version of my vibrant boy. He'd hide the pills under his tongue, spit them into toilet drains, convinced they were poison. "The man in the coat told me," he'd scream, his eyes wide with a terror that was all too real to him. "He said you're trying to silence me, to turn me into a zombie." The man in the coat, his constant invisible tormentor, a shadow that lived in the periphery of his vision. My brilliant, curious son was now a prisoner, and the jailer was his own mind. The tension in our home became a physical presence, thick and suffocating. The violence escalated from slammed doors to a shattered vase, then a fist-sized hole in the drywall next to Arthur's head. Every knock at the door sent my heart into my throat. Was it the police? A neighbor complaining about the noise? Then came the night that broke us. I walked into the kitchen to find Lucas holding a chef's knife, staring at Arthur with that terrifying, vacant look. He was whispering, "Just a little cut. Just to see what's underneath, to reveal the imposter's true face." Arthur stood frozen, his face a mask of heartbreak and disbelief. We had to call the police. My own son, my baby boy, was handcuffed and sedated on our own living room floor, loaded into the back of a squad car as the neighbors watched from behind their curtains. The shame was a physical weight, crushing me into the ground. The hardest journey of my entire life was the 3-hour drive to the Willow Creek Psychiatric Hospital in Phoenix. Lucas, sedated, slumped in the back seat. Then he woke, confused and terrified. His pleading began. "Mom, please don't leave me here. I'll be good. I'll take the pills, I promise. Just don't lock me away." His voice was my little boy's again, the one who used to cry after a nightmare. It took every ounce of my strength not to scream at Arthur to turn the car around. But when the orderlies in their crisp, impersonal uniforms came to take him, that childish voice twisted into something monstrous, guttural, and filled with a hate that didn't belong to him. "You're abandoning me. I hate you. You'll pay for this. He told me you would." Arthur and I drove home in a silence so heavy I thought it would crush the car. We had done the right thing, the necessary thing, the only thing left to do. So why did it feel like the most profound, unforgivable betrayal of our child? The house was a tomb. The silence where Lucas's laughter used to be was deafening. Arthur retreated, burying himself in the logistics of opening a new branch of his accounting firm in Phoenix, a desperate, practical attempt to be closer to our son. It was his way of coping, of doing something, anything, when he felt utterly powerless. I became a ghost in that empty house. My days were reduced to a grim pilgrimage, the long, lonely drive to Phoenix, the sanitized visiting room where I'd watch the medication dull my son's eyes, the long drive home. "He's stabilizing," the doctors would say with clinical calm, but this wasn't living. This was existing in a state of suspended animation, watching my son sleepwalk through a chemically induced haze. The flickers of the real Lucas were so rare, they felt like cruel mirages. But then, a new treatment plan emerged, a different combination of drugs, a more intensive therapy regimen. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, a change occurred. The haze began to lift, not entirely, but enough. Lucas started to make eye contact. His sentences became more coherent. He began to ask about home. After 8 long months, he was discharged. We rented a small, hopeful apartment in Phoenix, a desperate attempt at a fresh start, a place with no bad memories etched into its walls. For a few precious months, it almost worked. It was a fragile, delicate peace, but it was peace nonetheless. Lucas was quieter, more present. He helped with groceries. He even tentatively talked about getting his GED, about maybe taking a community college class. Arthur's eyes, which had been so dim for so long, held a flicker of their old light. On those weekends when Arthur would drive up from Sierra Vista, we would have dinner together, the 3 of us. We were a family again, battered and scarred, held together with tape and glue and desperate hope, but we were together. We dared foolishly to believe the storm had passed. We let our guard down. We trusted the calm. That trust was the final, cruelest lie life would tell us. It was a Tuesday, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. Arthur had driven back to Sierra Vista for a crucial meeting with a longtime client. Lucas and I had a quiet dinner. He seemed calm, even content. He took his medication without a fuss and went to bed. I stayed up reading, waiting for Arthur's usual "I'm home safe" phone call. It never came. The phone did ring, though, at 3:17 a.m. The digital numbers are burned into my memory. It was Benjamin, Arthur's business partner. His voice was shattered, broken into 1,000 pieces, barely recognizable. There'd been an incident, he said, a fight at a bar near the border. Arthur had tried to break it up, to be the peacemaker like he always was. A knife, one single brutal stab. He was gone. Just like that. The world stopped turning. The air vanished from the room. My Arthur, my rock, the man whose promises had built my world, murdered in a senseless, violent flash in a border town bar. I hung up the phone, and the silence in that apartment began to scream. It screamed of his absence, of a future stolen, of a promise broken forever. And then, a new, more terrifying thought clawed its way to the surface of my shattered mind. How could I possibly tell Lucas? How could I tell my mentally fragile son, who was only now finding his footing, that his hero, his father, the center of his universe, was never, ever coming home? I didn't have to. I heard a floorboard creak and turned. Lucas was standing in the doorway of his room, silhouetted by the hall light. His face was eerily, unnervingly serene. He looked at me, and his eyes were distant, focused on something I couldn't see. "The man in the coat told me Dad was gone," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any human emotion. He said it was time for it to be just us now. And in that moment, standing in the crushing silence of that Phoenix apartment, I didn't see my son. I saw the curse. I saw it, cold and triumphant, staring out through his eyes. It had taken my husband, and now it was closing in, ready to claim my boy for good. The weeks after Arthur's funeral were a blur of a different, deeper pain. It wasn't the sharp, screaming agony of the initial loss, but a heavy, aching emptiness that saturated everything. The world had lost its color, its sound, its meaning. And in the center of that void was Lucas, but he was receding from me, pulling away into a world I could not enter. The fragile stability we had built in Phoenix crumbled overnight. The man in the coat was no longer just a sporadic visitor. He became Lucas's constant companion, his confidant, his keeper. The medication, which had once smoothed the edges of his reality, now seemed powerless against this new, grief-fueled psychosis. His paranoia, which had once been directed at vague imposters, now had a specific, devastating target. Me. "You knew," he'd accuse me. His eyes narrowed with a terrifying clarity. His voice would drop to a conspiratorial whisper. "You and the man in the coat, you planned it. You wanted him out of the way." My attempts to comfort him, to hold him while we cried, made him flinch away, as if my touch burned. When I would prepare his meals, he'd watch me with a scrutinizing glare. "Is it poisoned?" he'd ask flatly. "He says you want me dead too. that I know too much. The final straw, the moment that severed my last thread of denial, came on a rain-soaked night, about 2 months after we lost Arthur. The sound of the storm had masked his movements. I woke from a fitful sleep, not to a noise, but to a presence. He was standing over my bed, silhouetted by a flash of lightning. In his hand, he wasn't holding a knife. It was Arthur's heavy metal flashlight from the garage, gripped like a club. His breathing was slow and even. "I have to make sure," he whispered into the dark, his voice chillingly detached. "I have to see if you're real. He says you're just a mask." My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I felt lightheaded. I didn't move. I used the calm, steady voice I had perfected over years of managing his crises, the one that belied the sheer terror freezing my veins. "Lucas, it's me. It's Mom. I'm real. I love you." I talked him down, word by careful word, until he lowered the flashlight. I led him back to his room, my hand on his elbow, feeling the tension coiled in his arm. I administered his emergency medication and sat with him until he fell into a drugged sleep. I didn't go back to my room. I walked into the living room, the ghost of Arthur's presence in every piece of furniture he'd chosen, in every book on the shelf. I sank onto the sofa, the same one where he used to pull me down to watch movies, and I finally let the tears come. But they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of utter, soul-crushing terror. He had promised me. Arthur had looked at me with all the conviction in the world and promised me we were safe. And now I was alone in this house, terrified of my own child. The most honest, horrifying truth I have ever been forced to confront washed over me, cold and undeniable. Lucas was a danger, not just to himself, but to me. Admitting that felt like the ultimate betrayal. A mother's job is to protect her child, to keep him close, to weather any storm at his side. But what happens when the storm is the child himself? What happens when the person you love most in the world becomes the source of your deepest fear? The life lesson I was learning was brutal and unforgiving. Love is not always enough. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is the thing that will break your heart into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Sometimes love means making a choice that feels like a betrayal of everything you believe in. The next morning, with sunlight streaming through the windows, making a mockery of the darkness in my heart, I made the call. My voice was steady as I spoke to the admissions director at the Willow Creek Therapeutic Residence, a long-term facility on the outskirts of Phoenix. It was a different place than the hospital, more like a group home, they said, with more freedom, but with 24/7 supervision. The process was clinical, a series of questions about the incident, his diagnosis, his medication. I answered them all, my voice a monotone. I was building the cage that would hold my son, and I was doing it with my own 2 hands. The admission day was a quiet, hellish affair. Lucas, heavily medicated for the journey, was placid, almost childlike. He didn't fight it. He packed a small bag, his movements slow and deliberate. He just looked at me as the counselor from the residence led him to the car, and the look in his eyes wasn't anger or the wildness of psychosis. It was a deep, profound, and utterly lucid hurt, a betrayal. In that clear moment, he believed, with every fiber of his being, that I was finally doing what the man in the coat had always said I would. I was getting rid of him. Driving away from that place, watching the building shrink in my rearview mirror until it disappeared, was the lowest point of my entire existence. I had lost my husband to a moment of senseless violence, and now, in the name of safety and sanity, I had willingly lost my son. I had signed him away. The house was more than empty. It was a monument to my failure. I had failed Arthur. I had failed Lucas. I had failed to protect our perfect, beautiful family portrait from the curse that had been lurking in the background all along. I was just a shell, a woman defined solely by her losses, going through the motions of a life that no longer held any meaning. For months, I was a ghost. I visited Lucas, but our time together was a painful pantomime. He was often distant, medicated into a soft, focused haze, or lost in whispered conversations with his invisible companion. I was just a visitor, a recurring background character in the tragic play of his life. I'd go to my job at the small medical clinic, I'd pay my bills, I'd come home to the silence. I was existing, not living. The turning point, as it often does, came from a place of utter vulnerability. It was a stupid, simple accident. I was reaching for a high shelf in the kitchen, my mind a million miles away, and I slipped on a spilled drop of water. I fell hard, my right ankle twisting underneath me with a sickening crunch. The pain was immediate and searing. I knew it was bad, and I was alone. Truly, utterly alone. "Lucas," I called out, a reflexive, maternal cry for help into the empty house. The silence that answered was a fresh wave of despair. I had to crawl to the phone, dragging my useless leg, every movement sending jolts of white-hot pain up my spine. I called an ambulance. At the hospital, the diagnosis was a fractured ankle, a cast for 6 weeks, no weight bearing. The doctor, a kind-faced young man, asked the dreaded question, "Is there someone at home who can help you, ma'am?" I looked away, my face burning with a shame I couldn't explain. "I'll manage," I lied, but I couldn't manage. I was helpless, and in my helplessness, something unexpected happened. When I explained the situation to Lucas's therapist during my next visit, a new plan was formulated. With increased support from a visiting nurse named Clara for a few hours each day, Lucas could come home temporarily to help. It was a test, a carefully controlled experiment in responsibility, and something shifted in him. The structure, the clear, tangible goal of caring for me, cut through the fog of his illness. He wasn't a patient in that role. He was a son. He learned to help me to the bathroom, to make simple sandwiches, to ensure I took my pain medication on time. He would focus with an intensity I hadn't seen in years, his brow furrowed in concentration. In those small, quiet moments, the vacant look would vanish, and I would catch a fleeting glimpse of the man he might have been. Clara, the nurse, was a godsend. She was a robust woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense attitude and eyes that held a deep, unwavering kindness. She didn't coddle Lucas or treat him like a fragile patient. She treated him like a capable young man who had a job to do. And she saw something in him. She noticed him doodling on a notepad one day, intense, swirling lines. "Those are some busy hands you have there," she said, not as a criticism, but with interest. The next day, she brought him a set of charcoal pencils and a large, expensive sketchbook. "Give that energy somewhere to go," she told him. And he did. He started to draw. At first, it was chaotic, frantic, dark, swirling storms on the page that mirrored the chaos in his mind. But then, slowly, shapes began to emerge. A haunting, distorted face, a landscape that was both familiar and alien. He was silent for hours, completely absorbed. He was pouring the unspeakable turmoil inside him onto the paper. It was a language he could speak when words failed him. It was a crack in the fortress of his illness, and for the first time in a very, very long time, a sliver of light was shining through. One afternoon, after Clara had left and Lucas was in his room drawing, I was straightening up the living room. His sketchbook was on the coffee table. I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help myself. I sat down and began to slowly turn the pages, past the chaotic, frightening images, past the angry slashes of charcoal. I found it. It was a drawing, rendered with a stunning, heartbreaking clarity. It was a man with broad, strong shoulders and kind, smiling eyes, holding the hand of a small boy. It was Arthur and Lucas, and it was drawn with such profound love, such aching loss, and such precise memory that it stole the breath from my lungs. I sat there, sobbing silently, holding that book to my chest. And in that moment, I finally, truly understood. The monster of his illness was real, and it was powerful, but it had not killed my son. Lucas was still in there. He was fighting, screaming to be seen from behind the glass of his psychosis. And my job wasn't to cure him or to simply keep him locked away safe. My job was to fight alongside him. My job was to find more cracks, to pry them open, and to let his light, no matter how filtered or fractured, shine out into the world. The art didn't just give Lucas a voice, it gave him a key to a prison we thought was permanent. That sketchbook, gifted by Clara, became his world. The frantic, chaotic lines gradually gave way to something more intentional, more profound. He wasn't just scribbling, he was exorcising. The man in the coat didn't disappear, but now Lucas could trap him on the page, contain him in a cage of ink and charcoal. He began to paint, and the chaos in his mind found a terrifying, beautiful order on the canvas. His paintings were turbulent oceans of color, deep bruised purples next to violent, hopeful yellows. They were unsettling and magnetic, windows into a storm most people are fortunate enough to never witness. Clara, our angel in nursing scrubs, saw the raw power in his work. She wasn't just a caregiver anymore. She was his first and most ardent champion. One day, her nephew Leo visited. He owned a small avant-garde gallery in the arts district of Phoenix. Clara, with her characteristic bluntness, shoved a painting into his hands, a piece where a distorted, screaming face was half emerging from a whirlpool of dark green and black. "Tell me what you see," she demanded. Leo, a man with a sharp eye and a hipster beard, was silent for a long time. He didn't see schizophrenic art. He saw intensity. He saw vision. He saw art. "This is incredible," he finally said, his voice hushed. "It's like emotional truth without a filter." He offered Lucas a show, a real one, not a charity event for special artists, but a legitimate exhibition in his gallery, titled Unquiet Minds. The news should have filled me with joy, and a part of me did feel a fragile blossom of hope, but a larger, more terrified part of me was seized by a cold dread. The outside world was a minefield of triggers. The noise, the crowds, the pressure. It could shatter the fragile stability we had fought so hard to build. It could send him spiraling back into the arms of the man in the coat. I was his mother. My first instinct was always to protect him, even from his own success. The night of the exhibition was one of the most terrifying and proudest of my life. Lucas, now a man in his 40s, stood in the center of the white-walled gallery, wearing a new shirt we had bought together. His hands trembled slightly, but his posture was straight. His paintings, framed and lit by soft spotlights, covered the walls. They were breathtaking. You could feel the emotion radiating from them, the fear, the confusion, but also a fierce, defiant beauty. People, real art lovers, critics, collectors, milled around holding glasses of wine. They weren't looking at him with pity. They were looking at his work with respect. They asked him about his process, his inspiration, and he answered. His voice was quiet, sometimes halting, but he was lucid. He was present. He was Lucas Vance, the artist. I watched him from a corner, my heart a tangled knot of anxiety and a pride so immense it was physically painful. This was not the future Arthur and I had painted for our son all those years ago. There was no accounting firm, no wife, no grandchildren playing in the yard. This was a different portrait entirely, painted with the broken pieces of our shattered dreams, stained with tears, and scarred by trauma. It was messy and painful and defiantly, heartbreakingly beautiful in its own imperfect way. Life, my dears, is not a fairy tale. There is no happily ever after when you live with an illness like schizophrenia. Lucas still lives with it every single day. He still has the man in the coat. He still has days where the world is too loud, too bright, too much, and he needs the safe, structured container of his therapeutic community. He will likely need some form of care and support for the rest of his life. The monster is still in the room, but he is no longer just the monster's victim. He has a life. He has his art, which has grown in depth and recognition. He has a small, carefully curated circle of people. Clara, Leo, a few other artists who see him, not his diagnosis. He has found a way to build a life of profound meaning and purpose within the walls of his limitations. He has taken the curse and, in his own way, alchemized it into something that can touch the hearts of strangers. And I have learned the hardest, most honest truths a person can learn. I learned that love is not about fixing someone. You cannot love a person out of their illness. Love is about showing up. It's about sitting with them in the dark, holding their hand, and waiting for a crack of light, without any promise that it will ever come. It's about choosing them again and again, even when that choice breaks your heart. The biggest betrayal is not the illness itself. The betrayal is giving up on the person who is fighting it. The most important life lesson? That sometimes the most beautiful and enduring portraits are not the perfect, pristine ones. They are the ones that are stained with tears, scarred by trauma, and pieced back together with grit and grace. They are the portraits that show the scars, because the scars are proof of survival. My dears, if you are fighting your own battle right now, if you are lying awake at night, terrified for someone you love who is lost in the storm of their own mind, please listen to an old woman. Hear me. You are not alone. The weight you carry is real, and it is heavy, but you do not have to carry it in silence. Your story is not over. The portrait of your life can still be one of profound meaning, connection, and love, even if it looks nothing like the picture you once held in your hands. If this story has resonated with you, if it has made you feel even a little less alone in your struggle, I need you to do something for me. I need you to let me know. Please type "I understand" in the comments below. Tell me your name. Tell me where you're watching from. Your stories, your shared burdens. Give my own story purpose. And if you want to join me for more conversations from the heart, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to this old woman, sitting in her little house in Arizona, surrounded by her son's beautiful, chaotic, and triumphant art. A permanent reminder that even from the deepest darkness, light can find a way to shine.